Welcome to the podcast on North American literature, hosted by the Research Group Studies in American Literature and Culture from the University of Granada. My name is Irene Palma, and today I will be interviewing Antonio Jesus Pascual, a student from the course North American Literature 2, that is part of the curriculum for the degree of English Studies offered by the University of Granada. Hello, Antonio. Thank you for being here today.
Hello, Irene. Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
Great. So, Antonio, you were asked to write an essay on literary influence. You had to explore and demonstrate the influence from one American author to another one from a later literary period. Tell me, which authors did you choose and how did you identify this influence?
Well, as I was checking the different literary texts that we have studied in the course, I noticed a similarity regarding the main characters that are depicted in The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper and those in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And more specifically, I noticed that in both cases, they can be related to the archetypes of the social outcast and the noble savage, because I'm talking in the case of Cooper of Native and Poe, which in this novel is called Hawkeye and Chingachgook, whereas in the case of Twain, we are talking about Huck Finn and Jim, the ex-slave. And I thought that it was interesting that both duos are composed of a white character and a character that can be perceived as the other. In the case of Cooper, a Native American, and in the case of Twain, an African American slave. And also, it was interesting that Twain had written a review on Cooper in which he criticized the fact that these specific characters in The Last of the Mohicans were not realistic, and I thought, with taking into account all of this, that it was worth looking at the similarities and the disparities between these characters to see if maybe there is something else here.
Okay, and what was the result of your research? What is the connection between these two very different literary works?
Well, as I began researching, I discovered that actually some scholars have identified this male pairing as a phenomenon within North American literature. They have noted its recurrence, and Bulk, in particular, has carried out a study that proposes acculturation as the rationale behind this phenomenon, meaning that uh, the duo in each case is used as a way of examining the values of white civilization, as the duo is composed of a character that corresponds to the social outcast, and that places him in a marginal position that is detached from white civilization, and his values are replaced by those from a different community, such as any American natives or African American or whatever, and that is the main strategy that is pursued with these two characters. And in particular, Bulk analyzes Huck and Jim as a symbolic father and son. But I thought that, especially even if this strategy is clearly seen with Cooper, I think with Twain, uh, more research was required. That I carried out an analysis that proves that this duo is used has more purposes, and well, there is a reason why the effect conveyed by the Last of the Mohicans is very different to that of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And so I use Bulk study as the starting point for my own analysis.
Wow, that's really interesting. Another particular aspect of this essay is that you were asked to use ChatGPT, right? How did you use it to explore this topic?
Yes, I use the bot as a starting point for carrying out my own research, but there were some problems regarding its reliability and accuracy. Because on the one hand, the bot told me that the analysis was original, so there were not really secondary sources that the bot used. And even if I asked the bot for some sources, even some of them were invented. So yeah, obviously the information that I provided in the end in the essay has been checked by me, but the vote was proven to be that you need to be really careful when you use it. And also another important thing is that the bot is good at giving the overall idea of a text of a narrative strategy from an author, but is incapable of explaining how this strategy is carried out, how the characters are depicted, or why the author has chosen these particular characters, which is the main starting point of my essay. So, since ChatGPT struggles very much with depth, with giving detail or making these connections, in the end, I have marked in blue in my essay the parts that the bot I thought they were okay, but I have most of the essay is composed of my own analysis.
That's important in order to make a responsible and helpful use of ChatGPT. So, what did you find when you started your research? What did you see was relevant for your analysis?
Well, regarding Cooper, I noticed that context was essential, not only because the novel itself is set in the middle of a historical conflict in the middle of the 18th century, but also because the novel was published a few years later to a conflict between Great Britain and United States, in which the English troops managed to reach Washington, and at the same time, the nation has been struggling with the with finding an identity of their own. They had this need of distinguishing themselves from Europe and from especially from Great Britain. And the answers to all these problems came with the figure of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was someone who managed to defeat the English troops that reached Washington, and he also participated in the expansion of the nation to the west by fighting the Native Americans. And he became this figure that was essentially a hero, but not just a hero to the nation. He became the essence of what was like to be American. He became a figure to look up to, and so some myth was formed around this figure and an oral tradition too. And Cooper is just an example of that, because obviously Hawkeye is the epitome of this myth that is the myth of the frontiersman, the essence of what is to be American, the essence of what is like to be in this continent, and he used that, and that is why the Last of the Mohicans is set in a conflict before the formation of the U.S. because the novel depicts or aims to depict the roots, the essence of what will be later the Americans, of a new white civilization in the continent, and basically what is called the myth of America.
Therefore, the duo that Cooper presents in The Last of the Mohicans takes part in the formation of this myth of America. Can you tell us more about how these characters fit this narrative?
Well, with Hawkeye, is very clear because he is always a hero. He always saves everyone from danger in the novel. He performs the most incredible acts, which Twain severely criticized. But that was because Hawkeye is designed to be a model. Is He's designed to be not the frontiersman that the American readership could encounter, but the frontiersman that the American readership could believe in. Um, he also is a social outcast in the sense that he grew up among the Indians. And he's different from the Europeans that are depicted in the novel. He's juxtaposed to them, but he knows the environment, he knows the continent, the wilderness. He listens to his companion Tinga's book, and he basically is better than them, and he knows when to detach from all those things that in this land are useless, the rhetoric, the morality that is not gonna make you survive in a hostile environment, and that's that wilderness. And basically it's a message of pragmatism, of being pragmatic and just resorting to your knowledge on the environment and not on words. And basically he embodies this what it's like to be an American, why he's different to Europeans, and why then he survives and he's superior in that environment.
And what about Chingachgook? What is the purpose of his character?
Well, Chingachgook is essential. He plays an important role in this myth because he is the if Hawkeye is the epitome of the frontiersman, Chingachgook is of the noble savage. The noble savage is an archetype that has been used not only in North American literature but in literature in general. It's a figure that is associated with an ideal past. Um, in the case of America, it's very relevant because when the European settlers began to arrive to the continent, they found this nature that they saw was pure, that was unspoiled by civilization, and they found the American natives in living in that paradise, and and basically the noble savage is used as a figure that um, that plays with the dichotomy of nature and civilization, meaning that nature is something good, something that should be embraced, is basically pure, whereas civilization is full of corruption, of decadence. And so the noble savage acts as a figure that, in the narrative, Hawkeye uses the values of Chingachgook, and so he survives. Um, whereas the European settlers who are unfamiliar with those values are incapable of living there. And but this is also problematic regarding the Americans because the Native Americans were depicted as were perceived as inferior. So the novel Savage was not a model of imitation, but a model of adaptation. The narrative in The Last of the Mohicans depicts the need of the Native Americans of disappearing. The novel Savage, in the end, is a figure associated with the past, is the past, not the present. And so that is represented with Chingachgook being the last of the Mohicans. Is a race that is doomed to disappear, whereas this new white civilization that is emerging in America, that they are going to be the ones that are going to inherit this legacy, and that is represented by mean of Chingachgook and Hawkeye, meaning that Hawkeye becomes the inheritor of that land, and the we that is depicted in the narrative that is said by the voice in the narrative is the American leadership. They are the inheritors of that land, and so the myth of America is formed.
I see. That makes sense. They both are the perfect characters for the depiction of this message. But then, where is the connection between this literary work and Huckleberry Finn? What narrative does Twain present?
Well, Twain also uses his characters as a means of exposure, and he also uses the character of the social outcast and plays with the idea of a character that is detached from social conventions. But uh, Huckleberry Finn is a satire, is a um, satirical literary work, and so the effect is very different, and the social outcast is very different. Huck is a boy who grew up without conventions that are that in society you're supposed to know, but for example, he's totally unfamiliar with the notions related to Christianity, and what he uses instead is his own rationality, his own common sense, and he applies that to the things around him. And Twain, in this way, develops what Passon calls the ingenuine narrator. The novel is narrated by Huck, and since he's familiar with notions that to the rest of the characters are common, to him these things are um, unfamiliar, and so they are interesting. And since they are interesting, he spends time thinking about them, and in the process, he describes them. And his unfamiliar view of things is the perfect strategy for creating irony or creating satire. And and yeah, it's also what we usually see with travel literature, when the figure of the traveler is the perfect way of playing with the dichotomy of a person who is unfamiliar with a setting or with traditions that to the rest of the characters they are familiar with, and since they are familiar with that, they are incapable of seeing some contradictions that are within that ethos or within that belief system. And and so, in the case of Huckleberry Finn, this is also used because Huck travels and travels to different villages, and he and satire is constructed to many different levels, also including Huck.
And Jim? Can he be considered a noble savage too, or is he a different type of character?
With Jim, the thing is very interesting because uh, Huck does learn from Jim, and as Bulk says, it's true that that what Bulk says basically is that uh, Huck replaces the some of the notions that he takes for granted, because even if Huck is familiar with many social conventions, there are other ones that he is familiar with. For example, slave owning. He agrees with that in the sense that he takes that for granted, that that is how things should be. And Jim makes him detached from that convention. But I don't think that Huck learns from Jim, as in looks at him as a hero, because in the end the effect of the narrative is to be satirical. One essential aspect of the noble savage figure is solemnity, is nobility, is that purity that I talked about earlier, and mm, and Jim lacks that completely. There is this incident in which Jim is with Huck, and he is depicting some of his, well, the narrative is depicting some of his superstitions, and there's this ball that Jim has that is meant to tell him about the future, but there's no nobility in that, in this superstition or in this ritual. Is even the narrative depicts it as something even disgusting, something that lacks the spirituality of the nobility that is supposed to have a ritual like that. And that is because in the end what the narrative pursues is uh, humor, is a satirical effect. So yeah, I would say that the narrative is meant to expose flaws and expose contradictions, but it's not that Huck sees Jim as a figure to look up to, like Hawkeye and Chingachgook. It's very different.
Then why do you say that the end of Huckleberry Finn is both different and similar to the one from Cooper's novel?
Well, they are similar in the sense that in the end, the conclusion to Huck, because throughout the novel, Huck is searching for his own moral identity. He is unfamiliar with many social conventions, and he has nothing to replace them with. He needs to find his own. What Jim does is that, well, what Jim is that he becomes the catalyst for Huck's final conclusion for Huck to find his own ethos, his own way of moving in in the world that is depicted in the novel, and is basically by contradicting the one social convention that he was convinced of, slave owning. He prefers to save Jim um, rather than following a belief system, because he sees that he says in the narrative that the most important thing is that to him is to just do things as they need to happen, to be pragmatic basically, and in this sense uh, that is similar to the message of The Last of the Mohicans. That is this identity of being pragmatic, of getting rid of moral beliefs that prevent one from doing what you have to do to survive. Because in this case, Huck saves Jim because he sees him as a friend, and mm, he prefers that than to social conventions. And so, in this sense, the narratives depict a similar conclusion.
Therefore, and as a way of summarizing the overall ideas of your essay, the similarities between the two narratives can be argued to be as a result of the potential that these types of characters offer regarding narrative strategy and conveying a particular effect, right?
Yeah, basically, they are both used as a means of exposure of flaws in civilization, of contradictions, and they both urge for the formation of a new identity. But in the case of Cooper, the narrative depicts an identity of based on national cohesion, of unity a nation or a new civilization in America, whereas Adventures of Huckleberry Finn depicts the ultimate individualism of not following social convention, not following the group, and just following your own instincts or your own ideas, your own common sense, and that is depicted through Huck, and that is why the effect conveyed is so different, because one narrative is full of solemnity, whereas the other is satirical.
Right. Thank you, Antonio. That was very interesting. It is wonderful that you have decided to share your research with us. It is very insightful. And thank you for listening to this podcast. I hope that you have found it interesting as well. Goodbye, everyone.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you. Goodbye.